I'm going to go quickly because I already said this to you all. But today's topic is EMBA admissions, overcoming a low GPA. I'm Dr. Shell of MBAadmit.com, and I'm very happy to be here with the GMAT Club again. So I was just saying a broad overview of our company is that I've been giving admissions advising for over 33 years. We at MBAadmit.com have very deep expertise in the EMBA process. And so we work with quite a number of EMBA candidates. We do have a team of advisors from top universities. And for those of you who want to opt for it, when you work with our company, you have the option of working with me. So that is always an option that you can choose if you sign up with our company. We have worked with all the top programs and helped to get candidates into each of these top schools. For those of you who want specific feedback on your particular candidacy, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at info@mbaadmit.com and send your most recent resume, and we'll send you a profile evaluation. You're also free to just fill out the profile evaluation form, which is on our website homepage. We do have a free EMBA book, so if you are interested in that, you're free to download that. We will be updating that in about 2 weeks. So for anyone who does download edition 1, we will automatically send you edition 2 when it comes out in a couple of weeks. And we also are going to be having some 5-minute webinars for those of you who are interested in particular programs. There are nuances to each of those programs and things to do and don't do. And so if you're interested in a particular school, you can check to see if we're actually going to release a 5-minute webinar so that you can learn more tips about how to be successful in that process. For a very limited time, we are offering 30% off. And so that's just to commemorate this webinar. And so it's going on only through February 4th. If you would like to take advantage of that, there are details on our website. So let's start with first discussing, is it a myth or is it a fact? Does GPA matter? We say it does actually matter in EMBA admissions. Now, some people find that surprising because for some of you who are candidates, the undergraduate experience was over 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And so your thought process would say, look, it's so far long ago, it should not matter at this point. But for many of the top schools, Wharton, MIT, and Yale, they do pride themselves on keeping that strong academic bar. And so for them, if you present a less than ideal GPA, that could be a problem. For kids, rather candidates who are younger, so say you're maybe 4 or 5 years of experience, that's quite young. And because of that, you will still be considered in the EMBA pool if you have a good record, but you're going to be much more defined at that age by your GPA still. So just be aware of that. For candidates who are older, again, it could be 15 or 20 years in the past, but you still will need to show more recently that you can do the EMBA quant work if your GPA was less than ideal. So it really does still factor in the whole process. So the whole question is, how do you know whether your GPA is going to be problematic or not for your admissions? The broader way to look at it is just know that it's part of a broad picture that the school is trying to get about you and your profile and your credentials. Here are 4 additional ways that they're looking to see, do you bring excellence? Professional career tends to be the very most important. And so if you have built up a record of great career success, that in many ways should be able to eclipse the GPA if you're able to handle the essays and make sure the recommendations are saying certain things. And so professional career by far is most important, and it actually can offset the GPA if you handle it skillfully. You also will want to show extracurricular activities, ideally leadership in the extracurricular camp. The academic history is made up of not just academic how you performed in college. It's also things like your standardized test score. Have you taken online courses? Do you have certifications? So that's the academic profile. And then there's always personal stories. Some people have a very strong personal story that they can weave into the essays. So that is the sort of broad picture that the school has about you. And so the GPA is just part of that, but it can factor in and it can actually cause rejections based on what school you're applying to, how low the GPA is and was when you're applying, and what your profile is. So the question is, what is a low GPA? In many cases, it is relative. So what I mean by that is a 3.1 in electrical engineering is very different than a 3.1 in political science. The idea is that political science is much easier to have a higher GPA in. So just because you do have a low overall GPA doesn't mean that it will close doors, because it really depends on partly what is the major. Also depends on what your profile is. If someone is underrepresented as an applicant, so for example, a Hispanic American, the schools want diverse classes. And so if they have fewer candidates who are Hispanic Americans applying, they'll be a little bit more lenient on a credential like the GPA. But in general, underneath a 3.4 GPA is going to be considered a soft spot if it's a school that's very picky, like Wharton or MIT. And below 3.0 is a point of concern for most of the top schools, and they're going to want to see other evidence that you'll be able to handle the curriculum, and in particular, the quant. It's really important that you try to have an accurate assessment of whether your GPA is weak or not. What you don't want to do is have a GPA that's not truly weak, and then you write a lot about it in the essays as if it is weak, because you're just kind of making something a problem that is truly not a problem. So you want to get a pretty good, accurate assessment of whether your GPA is problematic. And so the reason, again, it's important is it will affect whether you want to address it explicitly in the essays or in the application form. And it also will let you know if it is really going to be considered weak. It'll flag to you that you really need to work harder to make the other credentials that you have, whether it's extracurricular or professional, that much stronger so that you can override the GPA. For foreign nationals, there's an extra layer of concern sometimes. Sometimes if the scale that's being used is different than 4.0, the concern is once there's some sort of a conversion to a 4.0 scale, at times it does not look very good. So a candidate may come out with a GPA that sounds like a 2.8, but they are convinced that they were in the top 20% of the class, and so they're a bit of in a bit of a panic because they think, oh, I'm lost in this process now, and I can't get good outcomes, and that's actually not the case. Bear in mind that all of these schools have experience with the leading schools out of countries all over the world, and so they are familiar with what the grading is like at each of these schools. They trace it. They have internal databases, and so they will know what your GPA means when they see it. So that's one reason you shouldn't go into a panic if you know that you actually did well, but the conversion does not look very good. The other thing, a better metric for you to understand how they'll see it, is if you know what your class rank is, or if you know where you were in terms of percentile in the class, that will give you a much stronger sense. So if you were in the top 20% of your major, you should be able to sort of have a shot at many of the top schools, assuming you have strong professional success. For someone who was middle of the class, that could be more of a problem. And so you would go into the process knowing that your GPA will probably be considered low, and you'll want to take steps to override that. So let's talk about 8 best practices for overriding a low GPA. Number 1 is let time work for you. So for someone who has a very low GPA, if you apply sooner or closer to when that college experience occurred, you're going to be more defined by it. For someone who really wants it to not weigh very heavily in their entire process, the more time you put in between the college experience and applying, the better. So for someone who's 10 years out, it's going to be easier to override. For someone who's 15 or 20 years out, the same thing. There's more distance. There are other things to look at in terms of deciding whether this person is successful professionally and whether they merit an admission to a top school. A second best practice is to just bear in mind that your overall strategy is to isolate the GPA so that it's, less and less and less important, because you're presenting so many additional credentials that show excellence that you're giving the school incentive to ignore that GPA. The other things that you can redirect the attention to would include professional successes, extracurricular record, as we stated, personal story, and then also long-term goals. Sometimes if the goals are very impressive and very compelling, it redirects the attention away from a record that is years in the past. Best practice number 3, highlight in your essays and your resume the credentials and qualifications that show that you are top in your field. Those can be promotions, awards in the workplace, high performance rankings. If you have advanced responsibilities for your tenure, that should be reflected in the resume as well as in the essays. And if you have noteworthy successes, keep all of that front and center. And so as you're writing your essays, you should be paying close attention to that because it helps to redefine you away from the GPA. And the same with your resume as you put it together. Use all those successes, keep them front and center so you're redefining yourself away from the GPA. Best practice number 4 is use the recommendations well. So it's one thing for you to be saying, I've been very successful, look at my credentials, but the recommendations are an external source which will essentially validate what you're saying. And so you want to make sure that your recommendations are very strong and that they're paying particular attention to things that can help the admissions committee be more comfortable if the GPA is low. So they can write about your analytical strengths, problem solving skills, quality of your intellect, your ability to do quantitative work excellently. All those things start to say, look, the person of today is able to do quant very well. They're very smart. They're very incisive. And so you're redefining yourself in terms of where things are today as opposed to where things were years ago when you were in college. Best practice number 5 is secure a high standardized test score. Now, this is for schools that are requiring the test. I can speak in the Q&A about whether it's a good idea to take the standardized test if the school doesn't require it. Some people think that they should do that. That will take a bit of a discussion at the Q&A. In general, I will be saying that may not be the best approach. But so this number 5 is referring to when the school actually requires a standardized test, whether it's executive assessment, GMAT, or GRE, you want to get as high as you can because, again, this is a recent credential. And if it's strong, it's going to rebut what the low GPA is saying. The low GPA says that you won't be able to do the work or you might have a hard time doing the work. And then this more recent metric can say the opposite. So you do want to do as well as you can on the standardized test. Will it fully compensate for the low GPA? That's something that really can be answered only when looking at the specific candidacy. How long has it been since college? What's your profile? Are you overrepresented or underrepresented? What was your GPA? All those factors will be things that go into answering that question. But just know that the quant score in your standardized test is what matters the most. And so try to make sure that that particular component of it is looking very good. Best practice number 6, show impressive certifications or qualifications like the CFA. And so when you have these sorts of certifications or qualifications, and particularly if they are very quant heavy, you are giving another metric that the school can look at, which is more recent than the college record. And it will say this person has strong skills, strong analytical skills, strong problem solving skills, and they should be able to do the work in the program. So it's a comment on your quant readiness and on your quant proficiency. Number 7, in terms of best practice, is basically give them, again, other metrics to look at. So that could be another degree, online courses, or an alternative transcript. Those are 3 separate things. And so I'll talk about each of them distinctly. Now, another degree is sort of best practice. What will happen if you got another degree after the low GPA college record? Usually that GPA can be the one that they're focused on if you do a good job in the essays and the recommendations on redirecting to that second degree. Now, for many people, they'll say, look, I didn't have a need to go study something else, and so I don't have a second degree. Or if that's the best approach, I can't do that today. I don't have the time or the resources, and so it's just not feasible. If that's the case, then you go to what would be the second choices, which would be to go to a select course or courses and do well and be able to offer that. And especially if it's a quantitative course, that can sometimes help quite a bit. And again, the alternative transcript idea is simply that you take a series of courses, not just one. You're going to have strong grades on each of those. And then ideally, it might be from one institution. And so it will start to look like literally an alternative transcript. And you can put that forward to the school as well. So again, give them other metrics to look at to say that, look, this person does have strong skills and they can do the work. Best practice number 8 would be addressing your GPA directly through your essays. The one thing that's important to say is that make sure it's truly a low GPA. I've had many people who have thought their GPA was low, and then they'd come to me and I'd say, no, that's actually not bad, especially given the major. And so in that case, they should not directly bring it in because they're making something an issue that for the committee probably wouldn't have been an issue. For other people, if it really is truly a sore spot in your entire profile, you should acknowledge it and you should give an explanation and context for it, and then offer other reasons why they should believe that you're able to do the work that the school will demand. And so there are places where you can offer that information. There's optional essay. There are sometimes a special field on the application forms. And then in rare instances, if there is no optional essay and if there is no special field, you might consider weaving it into the body of the main essays. So what do you do if you also have a low standardized test score? So for the school that requires a standardized test, what happens if not only do you have a low GPA, but then you get a low standardized test score and you're not able to get it up? Some people think that, for instance, if they took the executive assessment and it didn't come in well, that they just simply can't apply to top school. That is not always the case. Sometimes the professional credentials are so strong that the school is willing to work with the student. And so you shouldn't necessarily write yourself out of those top programs. But you can, as an alternative, also consider applying to schools that do not require a standardized test score, because the logic is if you put forward two credentials that are both saying you will have a hard time with quant work, that's going to be a bigger thing to overcome than if they only have one metric, which is the GPA, and it's years ago. You can just be saying that that was years ago and that's not me today. So again, for the school that doesn't require a standardized test score, you actually, in theory, have an easier time overwriting because you don't have any second metric that may not be good enough. For the standardized test score, again, for those schools that require it, if it is also low and your GPA is low, you just need to get a really strong understanding of your own candidacy. And are you one of those candidates who will potentially override both? In the Q&A, I'm happy to give some examples of candidates who have overridden both a low GPA and a low standardized test score. It is possible. And so they've accessed schools like Wharton, Columbia, the top schools. So it is possible. And I'm more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about this. Right now, I'm going to shift gears and take some questions in the Q&A. But if you would like a profile evaluation, again, feel free to send your resume forward. We'd be happy to give you the feedback. And any other questions, contact us at the locations here on this slide. Okay, so I'm going to open it up now to Q&A. And I think that I guess I'll stop sharing my screen. Is that right? And then I will be able to see your questions. Okay, so I think you can still hear me. I see one of these questions here. So it says, I went to a top school for undergrad, but only got a 3.0. I later went to community college, got a 4.0. Well, a certificate is not going to be seen as the same as the undergrad record. So whether or not the 3.0 is a concern is, first of all, what's the school? Because if it's a super top school, then a 3.0 probably is a good GPA, not a bad one. And then secondly, how long ago was it? Okay, so if it was 10 years ago, even if it wasn't a top school, the 3.0 likely in EMBA admissions likely won't hurt you significantly. And so if the certificate for the community college is more recent, and it's a 4.0, that should be something that works for you. So hopefully that will help you a bit as you think about that. Okay, so I'm looking and waiting for another question. Let me see. I can see the questions on the wall here. So let me just scroll down some of these. I see another one posted here. So, okay, so are there reasons that will be considered an excuse for the fact that the GPA is low? I'm going to focus in on the word excuse right now because there's explanation and there's excuse. There are some reasons why that the committee will say that's a valid reason why you'd have a lower GPA, and therefore they will not penalize the candidate as much as if there is no valid reason. So what are valid reasons? Those can be things such as someone who had to work full time, like 30 to 40 hours a week while also going to school. So it'd be very hard to have a super high GPA for most people. If someone had severe health issues, if they lost a family member in the middle of the school years, if they had something like ADHD, those are reasons why perhaps the GPA may be lower. And therefore, if the candidate has one of those reasons, you can write it about it, likely in the optional essay. And in theory, the committees won't penalize you as strongly as if you don't have that. Okay, so the next question is, what is the lowest GPA I've seen a candidate have and still get into a top 10 program? I really have had some folks in the range of 1.8 to 2.1, and they are still able to get into schools like Columbia, NYU. So it's very possible, and it's all about how impressive are the professional achievements? How long ago was the GPA? Were there reasons, valid reasons why that GPA was lower? Even if there weren't valid reasons, say the person simply wasn't focused, with enough time and enough accomplishment in the professional arena, it is still possible, even with a GPA like that, to override. But you have to give the committee additional reasons, metrics that show you'll be able to do the work. That will be the main thing, the main concern. They don't want candidates to get in there and struggle, so you need to show them that you're actually ready for the work. So I'm going to read down some more that are posted here. So let's take a look at this. One question was simply, do you address all this in the optional essay? And it really depends. Some of the schools don't have optional essays. So if they don't, you're going to have to look for other ways to get it in. If they do have an optional essay, yes, you would address it there. Although, if the optional essay is lengthy, say it's 500 words, you don't want to use 500 words pointing out a weakness. And so, be concise, be to the point, and then make sure that most of your application is focused in on your strengths. Okay, so another question is, should I take the GMAT if my GPA is low and I'm applying to an EMBA program that requires? I think the question there is GMAT versus executive assessment. So some people think that because the executive assessment is new and in theory easier than the GMAT, that if they need to prove themselves in terms of quant skills or just overall, skills, the GMAT is the better thing to take. The problem is that most people at the executive level are extremely busy. And so it's rare that someone can carve adequate time to do really well on the GMAT. And so what I will find is that candidates who try, sometimes they come in after months and months of studying, they'll get a 660, a 640. Those are not super strong scores. And therefore, the GMAT may not serve your purposes. So it's really much more important to have a strong score. So if you're going to have a stronger score on the EA, so say a 161 or 163 with a very strong quant, that is probably a better one to put forward. And you can also show other metrics, whether you're doing a lot of quant work or whether you've had courses that were quantitative in more recent years. You can offer those in addition to the standardized test. Okay, I have one more here. Just one second. Well, so this question is about, it says, I'm a foreign national and I'm not sure what my class rank was or where I ranked in terms of percentages. How do I assess my GPA? Well, one way that you can try is to reach out to the school and see if they kept records and they can tell you what your class rank was. And so that would be a very straightforward way to do it. Otherwise, it's actually rare that I have someone who really doesn't have any sense of it. Normally, if I ask someone, where were you? Were you in the middle of the class? Were you top 20, top 30, top 10%? They normally have that understanding. And so just knowing that will be helpful for you. And so I think that anyone who is top 20% typically can still have shot at all the very top schools. And I even have situations, so say I have a foreign national from India who's second class in terms of distinction, and that's considered not a good performance. that candidate can still get into top schools if they have truly exceptional professional experience. So the way to look at the GPA is simply that it's something that has to be overridden. It does not necessarily close the door. All right, I'll try to take one or two additional questions. An example of when a candidate was successful to a top program with both a low GPA and a low standardized test score. I have multiple examples. And so, when I look at a candidate, I'm looking at the entire picture. And so I typically will have a pretty strong sense early on if a candidate can override both. And it'll be based on profile, achievement, and profession and other things. And so I'll give you three examples that come straight to mind. One is a young man, he's about 39, who had started his own company. It was extremely successful. So it had branches in multiple states. It had about $20 million of revenue. And it was a very honorable sort of business that he was in. And he was a truly magnificent leader. So he was able to pull out some great stories for the essays. And so that candidate had around about a 2.1 GPA and completely bombed the executive assessment. So he was somewhere around 139, which is quite low. And yet he was able to get into top schools, including Booth, Columbia. And again, it was just putting a great application together, made sure the resume really showcased all the strengths, and the recommendations were outstanding. So all of that convinced the school, in addition to offering other metrics that he was able to be quant ready. All of that worked to allow him to get into the school. I've had other situations where someone may have had to work 40 hours a week in college, and so they had a really bad GPA, like 1.8. And then the standardized test score may have come in not great, so maybe on the GMAT of 610. That candidate still, if there had been sufficient time since a college degree, so say 12 years, 13 years, and then they could point to other things, courses that they took that showed good grades more recently, that person was able to get into also top schools. So that was Columbia as well as London Business School. And so those are two examples. The third example would be a candidate who, he came from a family and he was working his entire time with this family business during college. And he helped grow that from being a mom and pop shop to a truly, multi-million-dollar company that was launching out operations abroad. And so, his professional success was off the charts. He also had a pretty low GPA, like 1.8, and was able to get into a school that did not require a GMAT score, which was Kellogg. And again, he showed other metrics that he was quant ready. So there's plenty of examples. A couple of those I just gave, the candidate had, grown a company to multi-million dollars. That does not have to be the case. It doesn't have to be such an off the chart sort of achievement, but just, someone who is clearly making an impact of the company where they are, who clearly has strong skills, that if you put the package together correctly, and again, the recommendations are truly key to that, you can many times override both metrics. All right, I think I have time for one last question. Okay, I'm seeing that that's all we are. So any more questions? If not, you are free to reach out to me at our website. And if there are any other lingering questions, you can either write us at the website or you can post it here. And sometimes I'll check back. And if I do see a question, I'll try to respond. But I'm very happy to have been with you today. I hope that you got some insights about how to handle the situation if your GPA is less than ideal. And we hope to hear from you. Good luck in your EMBA process.